Hello, my name is David Freud and I'm a former journalist, a member of the House of Lords and one of the judges for the 2021 Courage in Journalism Award. For many years, Mexico has been one of the most dangerous country in the world, outside a war zone, to be a journalist. And in the last year, the number of attacks on journalists has accelerated still further. Journalists who cover sensitive political stories on organised crime are frequently targeted, warned, threatened, abducted, disappeared, and often killed in cold blood. Here with us today to explore these questions is Pedro Cardenas. Pedro is the coordinator of Article 19's Protection and Defense Program in Mexico and Central America. Pedro, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
I'd like to start just talking about this is Mexico's most unusual. It's a democratic country. It's not at war. I mean, those are the two, the autocracies and the war torn countries are where you see high risk to journalists. Mexico's not in that category, and yet there are more killed in Mexico than anywhere else. And how do you account for that?
We believe we can account for this in three different states. The first one is historically. Mexico, while it is currently a democracy, for a long time was an autocracy controlled by a ruling party that in many of times set up a tradition of silencing those that it opposed. In many ways, activists, journalists would simply disappear in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And this tradition sort of continued and has been followed in many different scenarios. However, we can see a turning point in Mexico since the year 2006 when President Calderón at the time started the war on drugs. This generated a militarization of the country that has continued on for the last two administrations and the current administration as well. The use of the military, the use of armed forces as a way to combat has only resulted in much more pain and damage, in the sense that there has been a series of attacks from both sides. The presence of being between a rock and a hard place. The cartels on one side attacking and threatening, and on the other hand, the government that considers them as opposition.
And then, I mean, the context, of course, is, as we've just discussed, is a very sharp acceleration in 2020 of attacks on journalists. Is there any particular reason for that acceleration, or is it just building up and building up?
We can consider it a build-up. Like we stated, since 2006, we've started noticing this trend. And particularly since 2009 up to 2020, we can consider that there's an average of 12% increase in attacks against the press. Today in 2020, like we said yesterday in our annual report, we documented 692 attacks and aggressions against the press throughout the year. The majority of them are directly being caused by public officials, whether it be armed forces, security, civil forces, or public statesmen as well.
So, I mean, this talk about it being because of organised crime is actually moving away from the point at the moment. It's more the officials that are leading this process.
Absolutely. One thing that is interesting is that while organized crime is seen as the scapegoat, this is always organized crime's fault, in reality, we are noticing that a lot of information blockades, a lot of stigmatization campaigns, a lot of attacks directly in terms of how to blocking information come from the authorities themselves. There is this description of the press as sort of someone that needs to be pushed back because they're not telling us the truth, and the truth is barely controlled by the government themselves. So this is a very dangerous narrative.
And then many of the investigations, they start, but then they're stopped. again, that seems to be something that's being done by officials at both state level and at local level.
One of the biggest problems in Mexico undoubtedly is impunity. For instance, if we analyze the special prosecutor for crimes against freedom of expression, we've noticed that they have done 21 different sentences out of more than 1,600 investigations. So we're talking about an impunity that is above 98% of cases. 98% of cases simply do not reach, and this is specifically in the Special Prosecutor of Crimes Against Freedom of Expression. So we're talking mostly about journalists.
I mean, the issue of impunity, is there anything that can be done to make sure that there are more prosecutions and more successful prosecutions? Is there something to be done, or is it part of the wider issue of the attitude of officialdom towards journalism?
The attitude is for certainly one point. However, there are structural issues that need to be taken care of. For instance, the judiciary needs to have a proper independence in many situations from local and state powers. And as well, we also need to focus more on the type of research capacity that the prosecutor's office is having. In many ways, there is no attempt to aid to these investigations, and we're talking about very substantive issues. On the other hand, we also need more of a prevention strategy in terms of training and capacity building on our public officials and even our police officers. They need to understand what freedom of expression is and what human rights are, specifically in terms of journalists. We also need to pressure and build upon the idea that journalists are actually part of an very important part of democracy. Without journalists, we don't understand how the world around us works. We need access to information. The right to access to information is something that we can work in a strong campaign within civil society. How to understand what's going on. We depend on journalists in many ways. And that is part of my own human rights, to have journalists around digesting all the information and also giving the different points of view.
Clearly, the main issues are going to be solved within the country, within Mexico. But is there any way that the international community can help in this process?
Absolutely. The international community needs to keep pressuring the Mexican government to fulfill its obligations, not only within its own constitution, but also within international human rights standards. There have been multiple attempts by international organizations and by the United Nations itself to evaluate how these responses are being taken care of. For instance, the High Commissioner for Human Rights a couple of years ago created a list of 104 recommendations for the protection mechanism for journalists. The recommendations are there. We know what's the way, but the international community can help us a long way in reminding the government that it has responsibilities to its own citizens.
Pedro, thank you very, very much for helping us to look at this issue.